There are actions you perform every day, so small that even you forget them. A cup of coffee was set down on a table, a slice of bread cut smaller than usual, a nod in place of judgment. But what if I told you that those seemingly meaningless things are being quietly remembered by someone, and that one day, 4 men in black suits will walk into your workplace to find you? Daniel Carter is not wealthy, not powerful, just a single father working the morning shift at a small diner. He doesn't know that the woman who sits quietly in the corner every morning is not what everyone assumes she is. And he certainly doesn't know that his choice to see her, instead of turning away like the others, will change his life forever. Stay with this story, because sometimes the most important turning point in your life begins with an action no one notices. 5:15 a.m. The city of Cleveland is still submerged in a pale gray before dawn. The streetlights have not fully turned off. Delivery trucks pass by, leaving thin trails of white vapor in the cold air. Daniel Carter slides the key into the lock and pushes open the glass door of Riverfront Diner. The small bell hanging above the door rings out with a familiar sound, a sound he has heard for 8 years now, almost every single day. 38 years old, divorced for 3 years. Emma, a 9-year-old, is in 4th grade. Daniel is not the kind of man who makes people turn their heads. He is of average height, with shoulders slightly sloped from long shifts. His hands are rough from grease and dishwater. The lines at the corners of his eyes appeared earlier than they should have, not because of time, but because of responsibility. He turns on the lights. The small room gradually comes into view. A long, dark wood counter, brown leather swivel stools worn thin, a few wall-side booths with old red cushions. The smell of roasted coffee and yesterday's grease still lingers. Daniel hangs his coat behind the kitchen door, ties on his apron, turns on the grill. Everything unfolds in such a familiar sequence that he could do it in the dark. Pour coffee into the machine, prepare the eggs, pre-slice the bread, wipe down the counter. There are lives without grand climaxes. No loud turning points, just mornings that repeat themselves, so identical that people forget whether they are living or merely existing. Daniel belongs to that kind of life. Last night he sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment above a laundromat, staring once again at the overdue electricity bill. The amount wasn't large, but it wasn't small for him either. His pickup truck makes a strange noise when turning left, and on the refrigerator, a note from Emma's school is still held up by a star-shaped magnet. Field trip to the Science Center, $35. $35. For many people, that's just the cost of a day's lunch. For Daniel, it's a decision that requires consideration. He could pick up an extra evening shift, but that would mean Emma staying home alone longer. He doesn't want her to grow up too fast just because of adult burdens. Daniel pours his first cup of coffee for himself, takes a sip. The bitterness spreads across his tongue. He doesn't add sugar, doesn't add milk. He is used to things in his life tasting exactly as they are. At 6 a.m., the first customers begin to walk in. A truck driver, 2 familiar office workers, an older man who reads the newspaper every morning. Daniel greets them with a small nod. He doesn't talk much, but he remembers how they take their coffee. Who adds 2 packets of sugar? Who doesn't want ice? Who prefers the third stool from the left? He isn't good with words, but he is good at paying attention. 6:10. The bell above the door rings again. Daniel doesn't need to look at the clock. He knows who just walked in. The woman in the corner. Mid-40s perhaps, maybe younger, maybe older. Life has not treated her gently, so age becomes difficult to guess. An old gray-green military jacket, larger than her frame. The hem is frayed, the sleeves are slightly torn. Leather boots worn so thin that they no longer hold their original shape. Her hair hangs loose, uncombed. But her eyes are not dull. She always chooses the last booth by the window overlooking the back parking lot. Not the best seat, but the least noticed. A few customers glance at her, then look away. A new waitress once whispered, "She makes the other customers uncomfortable." Daniel has never responded to comments like that. He does what he always does. He pours a hot cup of coffee, prepares 2 scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, and before bringing the plate out, he cuts the toast into smaller pieces. No one asked him to do that, but he noticed her hands tremble slightly when she holds a knife. He sets the plate down in front of her. No questions, no pity, no special expression. She takes a few crumpled bills and some coins from her coat pocket, counts them slowly, pushes them toward him. The amount is slightly short. Daniel glances at it, then nods. That's enough. She looks up. Her eyes rest on his face a fraction longer than usual. No smile, just a small nod in return. Sometimes, kindness does not require declaration. It only needs to be carried out naturally. Daniel walks back to the counter. The waitress, Rachel, shakes her head. "You know she's always short." Daniel shrugs. "She doesn't bother anyone." Rachel sighs. "But she doesn't fit here." Daniel doesn't respond. He wipes down the counter one more time, even though it's already clean. Maybe because he understands something not everyone does. A place does not become worse because a poor person walks in. It only becomes smaller if it has no room for them. In the corner, the woman lifts the coffee cup with both hands, as if holding something warmer than the drink itself. Daniel glances at her once. Not out of curiosity, but to make sure she's okay. He doesn't know her name, doesn't know where she sleeps, doesn't know the story behind those eyes. He only knows one thing. Every morning, in the last booth of the room, there is a human being sitting there. And as long as he stands behind this coffee counter, she will not be invisible. He doesn't know that this simple choice, a cup of coffee, a few slices of toast cut smaller, a nod without judgment, is quietly opening a door he never imagined he would one day walk through. Some people walk into a room and almost no one notices. Not because they are invisible, but because others have grown used to looking straight through them. The woman in the last booth of Riverfront Diner was one of those people. She came so regularly that she became part of the morning rhythm there, like the sound of the coffee machine, like the clink of a spoon against a cup, like the morning news playing from the television mounted in the corner. But unlike those sounds, she was not anticipated. Only by Daniel. In the early days, she said nothing beyond a very soft, "Thank you." Her voice was not hoarse like someone who had wandered the streets for years, not trembling like someone who had lost all faith. It was low, clear, carrying the steadiness of someone who had once been properly educated. That made Daniel notice, not out of curiosity, but because it did not match the outward appearance. Some fractures do not belong to clothing. One January morning, the temperature dropped below freezing. Snow had not fallen yet, but the cold was sharp enough to cut into skin. She walked into the diner with dew-soaked hair, a damp coat, and hands shaking too much to fasten the buttons. Daniel saw it. He brought her coffee as usual, set it in front of her. This time her hands trembled harder. When she tried to hold the knife, the blade slipped from the toast and fell onto the plate with a small clink. No one said anything. A few eyes glanced over, then turned away. Daniel stepped forward, gently took the plate. No questions, no display of pity. He brought it back to the counter, cut the toast into smaller pieces than usual, then returned it to her. "Thank you," she said, more clearly this time. Daniel nodded, but her gaze held him for 1 second longer. The second was not long, but it was enough to mark that something had shifted. From that day on, she began adding a few more words. "How old is your daughter?" Daniel was slightly surprised. He did not remember mentioning Emma, perhaps during some rushed morning when he answered the phone mid-shift. 9, he replied. A beautiful age, she said, still believing the world is a good place. Daniel did not know whether to smile or reflect. On another morning, when the diner was quieter than usual, she asked, Do you ever want to do something else? I mean, besides this? Daniel wiped the counter. He did not look up immediately. I used to want to open my own BBQ place, he said. Proper Texas-style smoked meat, homemade sauce, a place people remember not because it's cheap, but because of the flavor. Then why don't you? Daniel let out a soft laugh, not bitter, just realistic. Life. One word, but it carried everything. Rent, tuition, insurance, sleepless nights, choices too risky to make. She watched him closely. If you had the chance to start over, she asked slowly, would you dare? Daniel looked up. The question did not carry idle curiosity. It carried the tone of someone weighing something important. I don't have time to dream anymore, he answered. Someone needs me to be practical. She nodded, but in her eyes there was something like disappointment. Not in him, but in something larger. Practical isn't always the same as safe, she said quietly. That sentence stayed in Daniel's mind the entire morning. A few days later, Emma had to come to the diner with her father because the babysitter canceled at the last minute. She sat at the counter, coloring in her dinosaur science book. Her legs swung beneath the tall stool. The woman in the corner watched for a while. Then she stood up and slowly walked toward Emma. Daniel noticed immediately, a father's instinct. May I see what you're drawing? She asked gently. Emma looked up, not afraid at all. Yes, ma'am. The woman sat down and took a napkin, folded it slowly, carefully. Her fingers no longer trembled as before, or perhaps when doing something familiar, they became steadier. A few minutes later, a paper swan appeared. Emma's eyes widened. Can you do it again? The woman smiled, a real smile. The first Daniel had seen. Not wide, but warm enough to make the small room feel different. Daniel stood behind the counter, watching the scene. He didn't know why his chest suddenly softened. Maybe because it had been a long time since he'd seen someone treat his daughter with that kind of gentleness. Maybe because he realized this woman was not merely someone in need. She had once been someone. Emma looked up and asked directly, the way only children dare to ask, Are you sad? The woman paused. Her eyes drifted somewhere far away. Then I returned to the present. Not today, she said softly. That answer made Daniel think. Not no, but not today. As if on other days, the answer might be different. After that day, the conversations between Daniel and her grew a little longer each morning. Nothing grand, just small questions. What subject does Emma like most? Do you like this place? Are you happy? The last question made Daniel freeze. He had not asked himself that in years. Happy. The word belonged to people who had time to reflect, not to those busy surviving. I'm okay, he replied after a few seconds. She looked at him, her gaze free of judgment. Okay isn't the same as happy, she said. Daniel did not respond, but for the first time in a long while, he wondered. Was he merely existing, or truly living? In the corner of the room, the woman lifted her coffee cup to her lips. Her eyes were no longer empty as in the early days. Something inside her was changing, and Daniel did not know that. While he believed he was helping her through small gestures, she was quietly awakening within him a dream he had buried long ago. The question, If you had the chance to start over, it was no longer a casual conversation. It became a seed. And sometimes, just one seed like that, it is enough to transform an entire forest. There are absences that at first feels like a small space, but as time passes, they widen until you can no longer ignore them. That morning, 6:10 a.m., the bell above the door rang. Daniel looked up out of habit. Not her, just a newspaper delivery man. He glanced at the clock. The minute hand moved slowly. 6:15. 6:20. The last booth in the room remained empty. Daniel did what he always did. He poured a hot cup of coffee, prepared 2 scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, and, as always, cut them into smaller pieces. He carried the plate out and set it down at the empty table. The coffee steamed for a few minutes, then gradually cooled. Rachel noticed. "You know she's not coming, right?" Daniel shrugged. "Maybe she's just late." He turned away, not wanting to acknowledge the feeling that had just brushed across his chest. The first day passed like that. He told himself, maybe she found somewhere warmer. Maybe she was sick. It could be a small change. But the next morning, the booth was still empty. Daniel made the coffee again, cut the toast again, set it down again. This time, he looked at the cup a little longer. Something inside him was beginning to feel unsettled. By the third day, Tony, the joking line cook, blurted out, "Maybe she moved to another diner, or the cops chased her off." A light laugh sounded from somewhere. Daniel did not laugh. "Don't say that," he replied, his voice lower. Tony looked at him as if he had just discovered something unusual. Daniel was not someone who angered easily, but this time he felt as though someone had stepped over an invisible line. Day 4. The coffee placed on the table was no longer a habit. It became a prayer. Daniel began noticing small details he had never thought about before. The chair where she sat had a slight scratch along the edge. The windowsill behind it had a thin crack shaped like lightning. The lamp above that table flickered faintly when turned on. Things he had never cared about. Now, they tightened his throat, because they reminded him someone had once sat there. That evening after his shift, Daniel did not go straight home. He drove around the park near downtown, stopped by a bus station, and walked through 2 alleys behind the commercial district. He did not know what he was searching for. It could be a familiar silhouette, a gray-green coat. There was nothing. Only cold wind and dry leaves rolling across the pavement. When he returned to the apartment, Emma was sitting at the table doing math homework. "You're late," she said. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I had something to do." Emma studied him more closely. Children read adult emotions better than we think. "Is it because she didn't come?" Daniel paused. "Who?" "The lady who taught me to fold the swan." Silence. He pulled out a chair and sat across from his daughter. "I don't know where she is," he said slowly. "I hope she's okay." Emma thought for a few seconds, then said, "I think she's good." A simple sentence, but it felt like something cracked open inside Daniel. He realized he was not the only one who had noticed her. Emma had too, and that was what made this absence heavier. Day 5. Daniel still made the coffee, still placed the plate down. Rachel no longer said anything. She looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "You can't save everyone," she said quietly when the diner was empty. Daniel did not answer, because he knew she was right. He was not rich, not powerful, not capable of changing the world, but he also knew something else. He had never thought he needed to save her. He just did not want her to disappear as if she had never existed. That afternoon, Daniel stood alone inside the walk-in freezer behind the kitchen. The door closed, the cold bit into his skin. He leaned back against the metal wall. For the first time, he wondered, where had he gone wrong? He should have asked her name. He should have asked where she slept. He should have done something more than pour coffee. Regret arrived slowly, but firmly. Some opportunities look like ordinary moments until they vanish. Day 6. Daniel woke with a knot in his stomach. He drove Emma to school, kissed her lightly on the forehead. "I'll pick you up early," he said. But even he wasn't sure what he was hurrying toward. The diner was busier than usual that morning, orders being called out, silverware clinking against plates, the coffee machine hissing. Amid all that noise, the last booth remained quietly empty. Daniel set the cup of coffee down. This time, he did not turn away immediately. He stood there watching. Steam rose, then faded. He did not know why this made his heart feel as heavy as stone. She was just a customer, a woman whose name he never knew, a woman with no address, no phone number, no past, he had been told. But she had become part of his day, part of Emma's story, part of his own understanding of kindness. And now, that space was growing. Daniel did not know that somewhere beyond his sight, another story was reaching its conclusion. And very soon, the door of Riverfront Diner would open, not for her to walk in, but for the truth to enter in her place. Morning of the 6th day, 9:07 a.m. Riverfront Diner had passed the breakfast rush. The last late-morning plates had just been cleared away. The air inside had settled, leaving only the soft clink of spoons against cups and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. Daniel was replacing the napkin holder at the counter when the glass door swung open. The bell above it rang, but this time, the sound did not feel like it had on other mornings. 4 men stepped in first. Black suits, polished leather shoes, upright posture, eyes scanning the room with the instinct of men accustomed to controlling situations. Behind them walked a woman in her 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy wool coat. Beside her was a younger man holding a dark brown leather briefcase. No one spoke, but the entire diner seemed to slow. The clatter of utensils thinned out. Conversations softened. A few customers turned to stare. Riverfront Diner was not the kind of place where people like this usually appeared. The woman approached the counter. "We're looking for Daniel Carter." Her voice was calm, clear, neither raised nor lowered, but it was enough for every eye to shift toward Daniel. He straightened. "That's me." In that moment, Daniel didn't know why his heart began to race, not from a specific fear, but from instinct. The woman studied him for several seconds as if confirming something against a mental file. "May we have a few minutes of your time in private?" Daniel glanced around. Rachel stood behind him, eyes wide. Tony leaned his head out from the kitchen doorway, face filled with suspicion. Daniel nodded. "Yes." They moved toward the back of the diner, the booth, the table where she used to sit. The coffee Daniel had placed there that morning still rested on the surface, even though he no longer hoped. The steam had long since faded. Only a flat, black surface remained. The woman's gaze flicked briefly toward the cup, just a glance, but Daniel caught a trace of emotion within it. She sat down across from him. The younger man opened the briefcase and removed a thick file. The 4 suited men remained near the entrance, keeping their distance. "Mr. Daniel Carter," the woman began. "My name is Elizabeth Monroe. I serve as legal counsel for the estate of Victoria Hale." Daniel frowned. The name brought no image to his mind. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "I don't know anyone named Victoria Hale." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "She passed away 3 days ago." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "Passed away?" "Yes. due to complications from heart failure. She had been ill for some time. Daniel lowered his eyes to the table. A face rose in his memory. The gray-green coat, the trembling hands, the sad but steady eyes. Victoria. Is that the woman who sat here? He asked quietly. Elizabeth nodded. The air in Daniel's lungs suddenly felt heavy. He had imagined the worst, but hearing it spoken aloud made it painfully real. Why are you looking for me? Elizabeth exchanged a glance with the younger man. Then she opened the file. Mr. Carter, before her passing, Victoria Hale left very specific instructions. She requested that we locate you, meet you in person, and deliver certain documents. Daniel swallowed. Why me? Elizabeth met his gaze directly. Because you were the only person in the past 2 years who treated her like a human being. Silence. The sounds of the diner seemed to retreat into the distance. There is something you need to know, Elizabeth continued. Victoria Hale was not homeless. Daniel looked up sharply. What do you mean? She was the sole heir to Hale Industries, a multinational construction corporation. Daniel blinked. He knew the name. Everyone in Cleveland did. At the time of her death, her net worth was estimated at approximately $780 million. The number landed on the table between them. Daniel did not laugh, did not react immediately. He stared at Elizabeth as if she had just spoken in another language. That's impossible, he whispered. She slept in the park. Elizabeth shook her head slightly. She owned multiple properties, but 2 years ago, after losing her parents in a car accident and suffering a severe psychological shock, she withdrew from her former life. She chose to live anonymously, without using her wealth, without her name. She wanted to know, without those things, how people would treat her. Daniel remembered the avoiding glances, the whispers, the casual jokes, the mornings she sat alone. Throughout that time, Elizabeth continued, she documented her experiences, the places she went, the ways people looked at her. Most of it was not kind. Daniel stared at the coffee cup on the table. He did not know what he was supposed to feel. Anger? Grief? Or simply emptiness? Elizabeth placed a cream-colored envelope on the table, sealed with wax. Then she set down a check. Daniel looked at it. The number was clear. $1 million. He did not touch it, not because he didn't believe it, but because he was not ready to. She left this amount to you, Elizabeth said. No conditions, no obligations, only one request, that it be delivered into your hands. Daniel shook his head. I can't accept this. You can, Elizabeth replied calmly. And she wanted you to. Daniel felt his heart pounding in his chest. He thought of Emma, of the cramped apartment, of the unpaid bills, of the BBQ dream he had buried deep. But above all, he thought of the woman who had sat at this booth drinking cold coffee and asking him, if you had the chance to start over, would you dare? Elizabeth gently pushed the envelope toward him. She wrote to you. Daniel looked down at the wax seal. In that moment, he understood something. The diner door had not opened merely to admit lawyers and security. It had opened to let in the truth, and that truth would force him to choose who he wanted to become. The envelope lay in the middle of the table, pale cream, thick paper edges. The red wax seal had hardened, stamped with a simple yet elegant symbol, an interwoven H. Daniel looked at it as if he were staring at another door, a door that could not be closed once opened. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up, not from greed, not from fear, but from the sense that something sacred was waiting inside. Elizabeth and her colleagues sat still, no urging, no interruption. The entire diner shrank around the last booth in the room. Daniel broke the wax seal, opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. He recognized the handwriting immediately. The same neat, compact script from the notebook she used to carry, the one from which she had once torn a page and crumpled it when her hands shook uncontrollably. Daniel began to read. Daniel, if you are reading these words, I have likely already left. I am sorry for not saying goodbye, but there are truths that, if spoken while still alive, would change the way people look at you. And I did not want you to look at me differently. Daniel swallowed. Each sentence echoed in his mind in her calm, steady voice. I spent the past 2 years living without my name, my wealth, or my status. I wanted to know, without those things, what remained of me? The answer I received was very little. Most people looked straight through me. Some looked at me with discomfort. A few looked at me as if I were a problem. Daniel felt his heart grow heavier. He remembered the glances that slid past her as though she did not exist, the whispers behind her back, the half-smiles of mockery. He kept reading. But you did not. You did not ask who I was. You did not ask what I had. You did not judge me by an old coat. You placed a hot cup of coffee in front of me, cut my toast into smaller pieces, and said, "That's enough," when I paid less than I owed. A drop of water fell onto the edge of the paper. Daniel did not know when it had formed. You did not dramatically save me. You did not change my life with a grand gesture. You saw me. And for someone who once had hundreds of people bow their heads because of money, to be seen as an ordinary human being was more valuable than any fortune. Daniel curled his free hand into a gentle fist. He had never imagined that such small acts could carry such weight. You once said you did not have the chance to start over. I want you to know, opportunity does not come from money. It comes from a decision. But sometimes, a little money can make that decision possible. Daniel glanced at the check still resting on the table. $1 million. A number capable of completely changing his and Emma's lives. I leave this money to you. Not so that you may abandon your life. I leave it because I believe in you. I believe you will use it not only to live more comfortably, but to make this world a little less cold, the way you did for me. Thank you. You for seeing me. Victoria. Daniel read the letter again, more slowly. Each word carves itself deeper into him. He carefully folded the paper and placed it back into the envelope. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Elizabeth said gently, "The decision is entirely yours." Daniel looked at the check. $1 million. He thought of the small apartment above the laundromat, of winters that cut through faulty heating, of the aging pickup truck, of Emma's college fund, of sleepless nights spent calculating expenses. $1 million could erase it all. No more overdue bills, no more end-of-month anxiety, no more double shifts back-to-back. But then, he thought of this booth, of the cup of coffee he had continued placing there every morning, even knowing no one would drink it, of the question, if you had the chance to start over, would you dare? This was not just money. It was a test, not of kindness, but of identity. Daniel took a deep breath. I'll keep a small portion, he said slowly, to make sure my daughter has a stable future. Elizabeth nodded. But most of it, he continued, I want to use to establish a foundation for homeless women and single-parent families, the place where they can find meals, temporary shelter, and, most importantly, respect. The younger man beside Elizabeth paused for a moment, Elizabeth did not. She smiled, a real smile. "I believe," she said. "Victoria knew you would say that." Daniel looked around the diner. Life continued. The clatter of dishes, the door is opening, orders are being called out. But inside him, something had shifted. He was no longer just the man behind the coffee counter. He had become someone entrusted with an opportunity. Not the opportunity to be wealthy, but the opportunity to choose who he wanted to become. He placed his hand on the envelope. "She once said," Daniel murmured, almost to himself, "that opportunity is always there. The question is whether we dare to see it." Today, he had seen it. And this time, he chose not to look away. 3 weeks after the day the doors of Riverfront Diner opened to 4 black suits, Daniel's life was no longer the same. But not in the way people might expect. He didn't quit his job. He didn't buy a new car. He didn't move to an expensive neighborhood. At 5:15 a.m., Daniel was still the first to unlock the diner. He still turned on the lights, still tied his apron, still placed the coffee pot on the burner. Only one thing was different. At the last booth in the room, where Victoria once sat, there was no longer a sharp, aching emptiness. It had become a reminder that a small act can outlive the person who performed it. After meeting with Elizabeth, Daniel spent many sleepless nights. He sat at the small kitchen table. Victoria's letter lay out before him. Emma slept soundly in the next room. A soft yellow lamp cast light across the surface. $1 million. The number no longer stunned him the way it had on the first day. It made him think. He could live comfortably. He could open the barbecue restaurant he had dreamed about. He could leave behind the long morning shifts. But every time he considered simply moving on, he heard her voice in his mind. "You didn't save me with money. You saved me because you saw me." If money were used only to make his life easier, would he be missing something greater? One evening, Daniel called Emma to sit beside him. "Do you remember Victoria?" he asked. Emma nodded immediately. "She folded the swan." "Yes." "She left some money for Dad." Emma's eyes widened. "A lot?" Daniel smiled. "More than I've ever had." Emma thought for a few seconds, then asked, "What will you do with it?" Daniel looked at his daughter, into the clear eyes that life had not yet clouded. "I want to help people like her," he said slowly. "People no one sees." Emma tilted her head. "Then she'll be happy." It was a simple sentence, but it was enough for Daniel to know he had chosen correctly. The Victoria Hale Foundation was established shortly after, not with grand press conferences, no billboards, no loud publicity, just a small rented office on the second floor of an old building near downtown. The mission was clear: provide hot meals for homeless women, offer short-term shelter assistance, deliver legal aid and psychological counseling for those in crisis. Daniel was not a charity expert. He was simply a man who once saw a human being in an old coat, and that made him the right person. He hired a small team, partnered with local organizations, learned step by step about paperwork, procedures, and finances. Elizabeth continued to assist him legally. "Victoria didn't want this foundation to exist only on paper," she said. "She wanted it to touch real people." And Daniel understood. What surprised many most was this: he continued working the morning shift at Riverfront Diner. Rachel once asked, "You don't have to work anymore." Daniel wiped down the counter and smiled. "I'm not doing it for the money," he said. "I do it because I like starting my day here." In truth, there was another reason. Every morning, he still placed a cup of coffee at the last booth, not because he expected someone to come, but because he did not want to forget. He did not want success to distance him from the man who once quietly cut toast into smaller pieces. One winter morning, Daniel received a call from the foundation's office. A young woman, about 30, with 2 small children, had just been placed in temporary housing. She had lived in her car for 3 months. Daniel drove to meet them. The room was small, clean, but modest. The woman gripped his hand tightly. "Thank you," she said. "No one has ever helped us without asking for something in return." Daniel paused. He thought of Victoria, the way she spoke about kindness without calculation. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "Just when you're able, do the same for someone else." On the drive back, Daniel realized Victoria's legacy was not in $780 million. It was in moments like this. Moments when a human being no longer felt invisible. On an early March morning, with a thin layer of snow covering the ground, Daniel and Emma drove to the cemetery. The sky was pale gray. The wind is cold. They stood before a simple headstone bearing the name Victoria Hale. Daniel placed a thermos of coffee there and a small paper bag. Inside were slices of toast, cut into pieces. Emma held her father's hand. "Do you think she knows?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up at the sky. He thought of all that had changed and all that had remained the same. "I think," he said quietly, "she always knew." They stood there for a while. No music, no speeches, just wind and peace. On the drive home, Emma rested her head against her father's shoulder. "Dad," she whispered, "I think she's not invisible anymore." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "No," he replied, "and neither are the others." Because in the end, what Victoria left behind was not money. It was a way of seeing, a way of living, a reminder that people do not need to be saved by miracles. They need to be seen. And when we choose to see someone truly, we change ourselves as well. Time passed, not loudly, not with fanfare, not with headlines on the front page, just days following days. And yet, something in this city had quietly changed. The small office of the Victoria Hale Foundation was no longer as silent as it had been in the beginning. On the wall-mounted whiteboard was a list of programs: emergency housing assistance, weekend community meals, and small scholarships for children in difficult circumstances. Each name on that list was a story: a mother fleeing domestic violence. An older man was evicted after losing his job. A young girl was forced to leave school because she could not afford bus fare. Daniel did not show up as a benefactor. He showed up as a listener. Perhaps because he understood what it felt like to be squeezed between responsibility and limitation, to carry anxiety at the end of every month, to choose between what you dream of and what you are obligated to do. And he also understood what it meant to have someone quietly believe in you. One late spring afternoon, sunlight filtered through the office windows as a woman in her 40s stepped inside, wearing a worn coat. Guarded eyes. Daniel saw it immediately. Not the clothing, the eyes. The same look he had once seen at the last booth in the diner. The woman sat down, her hands tightly intertwined. "I'm not here to ask for money," she said right away. Daniel gently shook his head. "No one asks here," he replied. "We just try to find a way for people to stand steady again." She held his gaze a moment longer. Slowly, her eyes softened. After their conversation, when she left with information about temporary housing and a free counseling session, Daniel sat quietly for several minutes. He remembered what Victoria had once said. Most people calculate. They weigh whether kindness is worth it. Kindness is no longer kindness when it is measured. It only has value when given without arithmetic. At Riverfront Diner, life continued as it always had. Daniel still tied his apron every morning, still poured coffee for the familiar truck driver. I still remember who drank it black and who added 2 sugars. But sometimes, new customers walked in. People dressed, eyes uncertain. Daniel did not ask who they were. He placed a hot cup of coffee in front of them, and if he noticed their hands tremble slightly, he cut the toast into smaller pieces. Rachel once teased him, "You always seem to know who needs help." Daniel smiled. "No," he said. "I just try not to overlook them." The last booth in the room was no longer a place of ache. It had become a symbol, a reminder that anyone who sat there carried an untold story. 1 year after Victoria's passing, the foundation had helped more than 100 people. Not an enormous number in the scale of the world, but enough to change 100 lives. Emma had grown a little older. On weekends, she often came to the foundation office, helping organize books or distribute bread during food drives. One day, Emma asked, "Dad, if Victoria hadn't been rich, would you still have helped her?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Why?" "Because at the time I didn't know she was rich." Emma was quiet for a few seconds, then nodded. "So the money wasn't the reason?" Daniel looked at his daughter and smiled. "Right. Money is just a tool. What matters is what you choose to do with it." One evening, when the city lights flickered on, Daniel returned to the diner after closing. The place was empty. Most of the lights were off. He walked to the last booth, sat down. This had once been the place where a woman sat quietly, drinking coffee and asking questions he did not want to face. "If you had the chance to start over, would you dare?" He had dared. Not by walking away, not by running from his old life, but by expanding it. Daniel placed his hand on the tabletop. "Thank you," he said softly, as if Victoria were still sitting there. "Thank you for believing. Thank you for seeing something in me I had never seen in myself." On another early winter morning, Daniel and Emma stood once more before her headstone. The air was colder than the year before. Daniel set down a thermos of hot coffee and a paper bag of toast cut into small pieces. Emma held her father's hand. "Do you think people can change?" she asked. Daniel looked across the rows of gravestones. "I think," he said slowly, "people always can change. They need someone to see them first." The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere, perhaps, a woman who once felt invisible was smiling. And in this city, because of a hot cup of coffee and a few slices of toast cut small, people who were once overlooked were now being called by name. Because in the end, legacy does not live in numbers written in a bank account. It lives in eyes raised, in names spoken properly, and in promises kept, between those who were once invisible and those who chose to see them. Some stories end with a number: $1 million, $780 million. Hundreds of people helped. But this story does not end there. It ends, and at the same time begins, in a very small moment. An ordinary morning. 5:15 a.m. Daniel unlocks the diner just as he always does. Winter is past, giving way to warmer mornings. Sunlight filters through the frosted glass, reflecting softly across the worn wooden counter. He hangs up his coat, ties his apron, switches on the coffee machine. Everything is so familiar that he could do it without thinking. But now, he thinks. Not about money, not about bills. about faces. The face of the young mother holding her two children in that small room. The face of the older man, tears in his eyes when he received a hot meal. Emma's face when she said, "Then she'll be happy." Daniel realizes what Victoria left behind was not only a foundation. She left him a new measure for his life. Once he measured the value of a day by the money he earned. Now he measures it by the people he does not overlook. 6:10 a.m. The bell above the door rings. A woman walks in, old coat, hair tied in a hurry, guarded eyes. No one else in the diner notices. Daniel does. He doesn't stare, don't rush. He simply sees. He pours a cup of coffee, carries it over, sets it down in front of her. "Good morning," he says gently. The woman hesitates. "I only have $5, she says quietly. Daniel nods. That's enough. She looks up at him. That look. He has seen it before, a look that expects rejection and hopes not to receive it. He returns to the counter, prepares eggs, cut the toast into smaller pieces. When he sets the plate down, she whispers, "Thank you." Daniel smiles. Not the smile of someone granting a favor, but the smile of someone who understands he is simply continuing something that began long before. At the last booth in the room, history does not repeat itself. It is carried forward. That afternoon, Daniel stops by the foundation office. On his desk lies a letter. Not from a lawyer, not from a donor, but from a woman who had received assistance 6 months earlier. "Because of your help, I found a job. My son is back in school. We're no longer sleeping in our car. I want to volunteer to help others." Daniel finishes reading and sets the letter down. He sits quietly for a few minutes. If Victoria were still alive, perhaps she would smile in that subtle way of hers. No applause, no spectacle, just a quiet nod, like the ones she used to give from the corner booth. That night, after Emma has fallen asleep, Daniel opens Victoria's old letter again. The edges are slightly worn from being read so many times. Opportunity does not come from money. It comes from a decision. He understands those words more deeply than ever. Victoria chose to walk away from everything to rediscover herself. He chose not to look away. And now, each person helped by the foundation stands before a choice as well, to continue sinking or to step forward. Daniel realizes something important. Not everyone needs $1 million to change their life. Sometimes, they only need someone who believes they are worthy of change. One weekend morning, Emma asks, "Dad, what if you hadn't cut her toast that day?" Daniel thinks for a moment. "Maybe everything still would have happened," he says slowly. "But I wouldn't be who I am now." Emma studies him. "Do you like who you are now?" Daniel smiles. "Yes, I do." Because he no longer lives only to pay bills. He lives to keep a promise. A promise never spoken aloud, between a man and a woman who once sat quietly in the corner of a diner. That spring, Riverfront Diner hangs a small sign near the door. Not an advertisement, just a sentence written in white chalk. "No one is invisible here." Rachel asks, "You write that?" Daniel nods. "Yeah." She smiles. "I like it." And it is true. In this place, at least, no one will be looked through. 1 year after Victoria's passing, Daniel stands alone before the last booth. The morning coffee still rests there. He no longer sets it down out of grief. He sets it down out of gratitude. Grateful for a woman who tested the world and unknowingly handed him a greater opportunity than any dream he once had. He speaks softly, almost a whisper. "You once asked if I would dare to start over." He looks around the diner. "Yes, I did start over." not by changing his life, but by expanding his heart. And somewhere beyond balance sheets and boardrooms, perhaps Victoria is smiling. Because in the end, legacy is not what we leave behind when we go. Legacy is what continues to grow after we are no longer there. There was one thing Daniel never told anyone, not Elizabeth, not Rachel, not even Emma. It was about the first evening he dared to stand in a kitchen that was truly his own and cook, not out of obligation, but out of a dream. After a year of running the Victoria Hale Foundation, Daniel's life had become steadier, not luxurious, not dramatically transformed, but solid. He had kept a small portion of Victoria's gift to establish a college fund for Emma. The rest had been invested into the foundation and community support projects. And then something unexpected happened. An old retail space near the downtown farmers market was listed for rent at a very low price. It had been vacant too long. A small space, exposed brick walls, large glass windows facing the street. Daniel stood in front of it one afternoon, hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't think about money. He thought about the question from long ago. If you had the chance to start over, would you? Dare? Now he had money, but money was no longer what made him hesitate. What made him hesitate was the familiar fear. What if I fail? What if the dream isn't what I imagined? He stood there for a long time until Emma tugged at his hand. What are you thinking about, Dad? Daniel looked down at her. I'm thinking whether I should try. Emma didn't need details. She asked, Are you scared? Daniel gave a small laugh. Yes. Emma nodded. Then it must be important. Her answer made him laugh for real. Perhaps that was the moment he understood. Starting over isn't about erasing the past. It's about stepping forward with everything you've learned. 3 months later, a small sign was hung above the door. Second Chance Barbecue. Below it, in smaller letters, because everyone deserves to be seen. The restaurant wasn't large, just a few wooden tables, an open counter facing the kitchen. Daniel designed the menu himself. Smoked meats marinated with recipes he once scribbled down during sleepless nights. Handcrafted sauces. On opening day, there was no red ribbon, no press coverage, just Emma standing beside him, holding a small pair of scissors. Cut it, Dad, she said. Daniel looked up at the sign, took a deep breath, then cut. The soft snip of the scissors echoed gently. A new chapter began. What surprised him most was this. The barbecue restaurant was not merely a dream fulfilled. It became part of the mission. Daniel chose to hire people whom the foundation had once helped, people trying to rebuild their lives. A woman who once lived in her car now stood behind the register. A young man who had dropped out of school was now apprenticing in the kitchen. A single mother prepared ingredients in the mornings. None of them was hired out of pity. They were hired because Daniel believed opportunity is not a gift. It is a door, and everyone deserves the chance to try opening it. Late one evening after closing, Daniel stood alone in the kitchen. The scent of smoked meat lingered in the air. The ventilation fan hummed softly. He rested his hands on the stainless steel counter. In his mind, he heard her familiar voice. You didn't save me with money. You saved me because you saw me. And Daniel finally understood the most important truth. Victoria had not only given him $1 million, she had given him a mirror in which he could see the man he was capable of becoming. Without those mornings cutting toast into smaller pieces, without the last booth in the diner, without the absence that made him realize how deeply he cared, he might never have dared to open this place. He might have continued living okay. But now, he wasn't just okay. He was alive. A year year and a half after Victoria's passing, Daniel and Emma stood again before her headstone. This time they brought a small box. Inside was a bottle of homemade BBQ sauce with a handwritten label. For the one who gave me my second chance. Daniel placed it beside the familiar thermos of coffee. Emma asked, "Do you think she'd be proud?" Daniel looked at the evening sky, turning pale orange. "I think," he said slowly, "she doesn't need to be proud. She needs to know her decision wasn't wasted." They stood there a little longer. No sorrow, no regret, just peace. On the drive home, Emma asked, "Dad, does everyone get a second chance?" Daniel slowed at a red light. He thought carefully. "Not everyone gets money," he said, "but everyone gets a moment to choose." "Choose what?" "To see someone, or to turn away." He looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. And sometimes, that choice opens a second chance for yourself. The light turned green, the car moved forward, and in one corner of the city, a small barbecue restaurant glowed warmly, selling more than smoked meat. Selling belief. The belief that starting over is not a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It is the reward for those who dare to see value in the smallest, most overlooked things. There was a truth Daniel took a long time to understand. Victoria did not come to Riverfront Diner looking for pity. She came looking for confirmation. There is no confirmation that she was wealthy, not confirmation that she was important, but confirmation that when she had nothing left in her hands, she was still a human being worthy of being seen. And the irony was, the person who gave her that answer was a man who believed he was nothing special. 2 years after Victoria's passing, the city of Cleveland remained the same. The same misty streets in the morning, the same hurried crowds, the same street corners where someone sat quietly waiting for the day to pass. But something was different. The Victoria Hale Foundation had expanded, opening a small additional center dedicated to emergency support for women and children. Second Chance Barbecue had become a familiar neighborhood gathering place, not because it was luxurious, but because it felt warm. On the wall of the restaurant hung a small framed picture, not of Victoria in a gala dress or standing in front of a corporate headquarters, but a drawing by Emma. A woman is sitting at the last booth. A cup of coffee in front of her, a plate of toast cut into small pieces was beside it. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Thank you for teaching us how to see." Customers often asked about the picture. Daniel never told the full story. He said, "She's the one who reminded me that no one should feel invisible." One evening near the end of the year, the foundation hosted a community meal in the backyard of the barbecue restaurant. There were no divisions between guests and hosts, no VIP tables, just long tables placed side by side. Those who had once received help now sat beside those helping others. Daniel stood at the edge of the yard watching. He did not stand at the center. He did not give a long speech. He watched. A mother smiled as her child ate a piece of smoked meat for the first time in months. A young man who once slept on a park bench, talking about his plan to learn a trade. An older woman holding Emma's hands as she teaches her how to knit. Daniel realized something. Kindness does not create loud echoes. It creates small ripples. But if enough people keep creating those ripples, the sea will change. That night, after everyone had gone home, Daniel sat alone at the last booth, a cup of coffee in front of him. He no longer placed it there for Victoria. He placed it there for himself, to remember how close he had come to missing this opportunity, how close he had come to seeing those mornings as work, how close he had come to seeing that booth as just a seat. If that day he had listened to his coworkers, if he had decided, "It's not my business," if he had chosen to turn away like everyone else, Victoria might still have passed away. Her wealth would still have existed, but he, Daniel Carter, would never have discovered who he could become. He spoke softly, as if summarizing it for himself. No one changed my life with a miracle. One person asked me a question, and I dared to answer. The next morning, just after sunrise, a boy of about 12 walked into the diner with his mother. Worn clothes, shy eyes. Daniel saw him. He stepped forward and placed a warm glass of milk and a small meal in front of the boy. The boy looked up, startled. I didn't order anything. Daniel smiled. I know. The boy glanced at his mother. The woman flushed slightly. Daniel added just one sentence. Here, you don't have to ask. In that moment, he understood. This story wasn't over. It was simply continuing in small moments like this. That afternoon, Daniel and Emma went to the cemetery again. Not because it was an anniversary, just because they wanted to. A soft wind blew. The sky was pale blue. Daniel placed a hot cup of coffee down. Emma placed a paper swan. Dad, she asked quietly, is everyone afraid of being invisible? Daniel thought for a moment. Yes, he answered. Everyone wants to be seen by someone, not for money, not for fame, but because it proves they exist. Emma nodded. So what should we do? Daniel took his daughter's hand. We just don't turn away. They stood there for a few minutes. No tears, no dramatics, just a deep stillness. You may be watching this story and thinking it's rare. That's not everyone who meets a millionaire pretending to be homeless. That's true. But you will meet many invisible people. In a coffee shop, on a bus, in your office, even in your own family. And you will have a choice, to see them or to turn away. Daniel chose to see, and that choice changed everything. Not because of $1 million, but because he realized a person's true value is not found in what they own. It is found in how they treat someone who has nothing. The greatest thing Victoria left this world was not money. It was a question. If you had the chance to start over, would you dare?